still got a few people coming in. I'm gonna excerpts from Genesis to kind of get going a little bit this morning. You guys will recall this is now the third week of this quarter, and in the first week we kind of talked about, we prepared ourselves for the difficulty in studying this question, why bad things happen to good people. And one of the things, or some of the things that we wanted to emphasize in that kind of introductory lesson was this idea that God's thoughts are not our thoughts. And so the closer that we come to what the truth really is in spiritual matters, the more difficult we often find it to understand. And that makes sense to me because, as the scriptures tell us, God's thoughts are not our thoughts and His ways are not our ways. And so that kind of makes sense to me. Last week we talked about the idea of omnipotence, and we specifically tried to help, we tried to identify what we really mean by possibility and impossibility and how those play into what God allows His creatures to experience. And so we're going to touch on that again today, because we're going to talk about the inexorable laws of nature. The inexorable laws of nature. Inexorable just means, like unchanging, unyielding. And so that's kind of what our topic is this morning. I have a PowerPoint, but God blesses us all in different ways. And I have a second-rate brain. He gave the first-rate brains to other people, and I have a second-rate brain. And so I forgot the PowerPoint little USB dongle thingy. But it's coming. It's coming. And so as soon as you get that, if you would just wave at me, and because I'm going to sing a song until that arrives. No, I'm not either. We're going to go ahead and get into the lesson. But anyway, as soon as that arrives, then we'll have something to look at. But anyway, a little bit from Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I'm going to skip. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Then God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." Then God said, "Let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place, and let the dry lands appear." Then God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation." Then God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate day from the night." God made the two great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. Then God said, "Let the waters teem with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth in the open expanse of the heavens." Then God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures after their kind, cattle and creeping things, and the beasts of the earth after their kind." Then God said, "Let us make man in our own image, according to our likeness." And then God said, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the surface of all the earth." I read that, and what we're going to talk about this morning is this idea of the laws of nature, and we kind of started this for a few minutes at the end of class last week, and I want to delve into that deeper this morning. But in the those excerpts from Genesis 1, the narrative describing the creation, you'll notice that God did things in an order. And I want you to think about and ask yourself, could God have created the earth in a different order than he related there in Genesis chapter 1? Could he have done it in a different order? Well, you know, when you think about that, I suppose there are some things he may have chosen to do differently. For example, the one that comes to my mind when I think about what we just read is he created light. He said, "Let there be light." But then later on, he creates the sun and the moon, the greater light and the lesser light. And I suppose it's possible in God's omnipotent power. This is an implicit possibility, right, or a tacit possibility we talked about last week. He could have somehow generated light in a way we don't understand or know about, and then later on created the sun. To me, that's possible and reasonable. But there are some things that he could not have done, I don't believe, in a different order, because they would be, as we talked about last week, they would be self-contradictory. You know, could God have created let me think. I'm trying to find it. Let me look back there and there you go. Thank you very much. Could he have created fish without water? Living fish anyway, without water? Well, no, I kind of don't think so. But so you see what I'm driving at. There are things that because they would be self-contradictory, some things have to come before the other. And so we don't have any problem with that. And that's going to really come into play, I think, as we think about the laws, what we call the laws of nature. Now, when we think about the laws of nature, and we listed some last week, and thank you very much. Go on to slide number 3, if you would. That's good. That's good. These are some of the, boy, that thing's just blown right off the screen. I apologize. It must be me. But anyway, those are some of the things I think we kind of talked about last week. For example, we noted that we lost it. But anyway, but objects have mass, right? I mean, that's clear. Objects have mass. If you're going to be an object, if you're going to be an object and be made of matter, you're going to have mass. And so my rear end has mass, and this bench has mass, and therefore I can sit on it, right? I mean, those things kind of go together. Two objects cannot occupy the same space at the same time. That's pretty clear, right? That's what car crashes are about, right? Two objects can't occupy the same space at the same time. Can we get the screen up here on as well? Gravity. Obviously, gravity is the obvious one. We talked about gravity. We discussed a little bit the laws of motion, and those are things that are kind of make up the universe. We didn't talk about time, I don't think, but time is, I think, part of the fabric of the universe that is part of this creation, I think. And there are some chemical interactions. What I was thinking about there was fire, for example. It's kind of secondary to some of these other physical laws, but nonetheless, the idea of fire and the chemical reactions is kind of a secondary. I'm going to consider it kind of a law of nature, because we're going to talk about a little bit nature, but I wanted to include that. But you notice that the natural laws, all of these things that we talked about last week, they're consistent and they're dependable for us, right? You can pretty much depend upon the idea that if I, were to hold an object and let it go, gravity is going to help it fall to the ground. We can depend on that. And it pretty much always happens that way, right? It always happens that way. And in fact, one of the things that this is important to us, one of the reasons this is important to us, the laws of nature, is because sometimes there is pain that is attributable to the laws of nature. This idea of gravity, if I drop something, gravity helps it fall, and if it lands on my toe, then pain is now associated with that, right? And so the skeptic will say, well, the laws of nature are what caused that pain. And so you have the skeptic's view sometimes that God is omnipotent and God can do all things. Why did He create nature in such a way that it would permit pain to His creatures? Why did He create nature the way that He did with this particular set of laws, if in fact pain can be the outcome? Go on to the, I guess you don't have to. I guess I can do that, right? And so what we're going to talk about is, I think, first off, is the necessity, if you will, for natural laws. And these natural laws, like we just talked about, they make up the environment in which we live. Time and gravity and laws of motion, these are kind of the environment in which we live. And so what we're going to postulate is that those things are necessary. They are necessary for beings created like us to exist. And so that's kind of one of the propositions I think we're going to put forward this morning. We stipulated last week. Randy, you have something?
Yeah.
Go ahead. Well, we're going to talk about that very thing, Randy, and I think I'm going to maybe, I have a little bit different view of that. So stick with me for just 1 minute. What Randy said was, well, in the Garden of Eden, He created it without pain. And so let's just explore that a little bit further. Let's see. Recall last week, we talked about impossibility kind of in 3 different types. We talked about, things we call impossible that aren't impossible, they're just difficult, right? They're hard. And we talked about impossibilities that are really tacit possibilities. In other words, they had this unspoken clause, unless. It's impossible for me to see my car in the parking lot unless I go into the foyer and look through the window, and then I could see it. And so it's impossible, but it's possible. It's only impossible unless something. And so there's that kind of impossibility. It's impossible for Jack Hall to do a handstand unless he has physical attributes similar to mine and training similar to mine. Then it would be possible, right? And so there's impossible but tacitly possible. And then there is the impossible that is self-contradictory, or the intrinsic impossibilities. And the intrinsic impossibilities, the things that are self-contradictory, are impossible for all agents. They're impossible for us, and they're impossible for God, because they're self-contradictory. So they're not real things. They're just, they're just words that can't possibly have any real meaning because of their self-contradictory nature. So we talked about that and spent quite a bit of time on that last week. So you've got to keep that kind of impossibility kind of in your mind as we go through this. So let's think about this question. Is it possible for God to create a nature, an environment, that would sustain multiple souls, and multiple souls, I might add, that exercise free will? And remember, free will is something that we stipulated last week. You guys recall there were several of these stipulations. God exists, and God is omnipotent, and those things. And one of the things we stipulated was that creatures have free will, and I think this is going to come into play. So let me ask you to do something. Do a thought experiment with me. This is, I want you to try to imagine a consciousness, an awareness that exists without a nature or an environment. That's kind of a crazy thing, but I want you to try to imagine that in your mind. This awareness, this consciousness, what do you imagine? You know, I used to like Star Trek. Actually, I still like Star Trek. I just don't have time to watch it very much anymore. But on the old Star Trek episodes, you would get these weird beings, and they would be, you know, floating in space, and, you know, they were like that, and they didn't have bodies, you know, and so forth. So you get these kind of weird things, and maybe that's what I'm thinking about. But when I ask you that question, probably, I'm going to say almost definitely, the first thing that you did when you imagined such a being, if you were able to pull it off at all, is you put it in some kind of a space, didn't you? I mean, it had to exist in some kind of space. The idea that there can be an awareness or a consciousness that exists without any environment seems self-contradictory to me. Go ahead, Brian.
Probably the closest thing I can come to that is artificial intelligence and computer learning.
Okay.
So they do operate on computers, but it's more of a dispersed network of computers. It's almost in the electronic space.
Yeah, you know, you say that. I would consider this. What is the environment for that kind of intelligence? Well, somehow that's a programmed thing. So there is an environment of programming logic and rules that seem to be the environment, even for artificial intelligence, it seems like to me. And so the idea that there can be intelligence without environment seems contradictory still to me. Does that make sense? And so we have, and I think it is necessary that we have an environment. Another thing that you might think about is we said that this was a consciousness. Now, I didn't put a body in there, right? That would have been too far down the road. But this, if you're going to be conscious, right, what does it mean to be conscious? Let me ask that question. When we say we're conscious beings, what does that mean? Okay, Lena says aware of your surroundings. Okay, that's excellent. And I think there is a corollary to that. Somebody said something. Awake. Okay, good. That's a really down-to-earth metaphor, right? Just waking up. When you wake up, now you're aware of your environment, like Lena said, right? Excellent, good. What else? Okay, interact in some way. Excellent, very good. Go ahead, Gary. Okay, you're kind of going, I think, where this had to go, Gary, and I think you're exactly right. And in fact, what Gary said was, for those who couldn't hear him, is he said self-aware. And what I was really kind of headed to was, you have to be conscious means you recognize yourself, self-aware, as distinct from others, right? It may be the environment. So like Lena said, you recognize this environment. And most importantly, I recognize that I am not the environment. And that goes to self-aware. You agree with that, Gary? Okay, good. So that's the most basic thing, right? To be conscious is to be aware that you are not, that the self is distinct. I recognize myself as a self. Could God create such beings? You know? In my mind, my second-rate brain mind, I suppose it's possible, it's tacitly possible, that God could create a universe in which there was a single consciousness, and that consciousness could have even free will, couldn't it? Having free will it would have one choice to make in this environment, and it would choose either itself or God, right? And so that's absolutely the bare minimum I suppose you could have. And could God create such a universe? I suppose he could. And for all I know, for all we know, there are universes out there just like that God created in just that way. I have no idea. I wouldn't say it's not that way. But that's not the universe we live in, right? And so we have to consider, and I think we should consider, what our universe is and what our nature consists of. And so that's where we're going, that's what we're going to focus on. But I wanted to focus on this other because I want to drill into people's minds this idea of intrinsically impossible. It is the intrinsically impossible things that are not possible for God. And so keep that in the back of your mind. Self-contradictory things are not possible for God. Go ahead. That is exactly what I'm saying. Some things are impossible if they are self-contradictory. You may not have... Go ahead. Okay. Go ahead, Titus.
I would agree with you to the extent of our understanding. Now, when you leave the human and go to the divine, nothing is impossible.
Okay, go ahead, Mike.
It is impossible for God to lie. Titus 1. Because anything that is against his nature, it is impossible for him to do.
That would be self-contradictory, wouldn't it?
That's right.
For God's nature as it is and him to lie. Those are self-contradictory terms. In the same way that could God create light and dark at the same time? Well, those are self-contradictory. And so that's not something that God could do, but it's not something that anyone could do because it's nonsense is what it is. Does that follow what I'm saying there? I think everything that is possible, even in God's wisdom and power, those things that are possible for God, absolutely. But I think there are nonsense things, self-contradictory, that skeptics will bring up over and over and over again, that they're nonsense. They are intrinsically impossible because they're self-contradictory. That's the kind of impossibility I'm talking about, Lena. God's power is absolutely unlimited to all of those things that are not intrinsically, self-contradictorily impossible. Does that make sense? Okay. And the reason that's important, Lena, I keep drilling this home, because that's what skeptics will use over and over. The self-contradictory. Go ahead, Tom.
I've had this conversation in my lifetime many times, and it boils down to something like, could God make a rock so that you can't pick it up?
Yes. Thank you very much.
And with what Titus said, we deal with things, and certainly a skeptic who's arguing against God is thoroughly grounded in what their senses, which you talked about earlier, right? And so the answer to that is, yes, he can, and you will have that answer in due time, because we will have, at some time in the future, we will have those measures. So he can do that, and you will thoroughly understand it, and you will be convinced that he can do it.
Very good. Go ahead, Mathis. John.
There's math terms too. There's the irrational numbers and things and a simple one would be just a quantity divided by 0. It has no value. It's infinite.
Yeah.
So we're aware of those physical impossibilities. We still try to quantify them, but they're quantified irrationally.
Yeah. And in fact, you're mentioning that. I'm not. I like to read physics books sometimes, not deep physics books. I don't have a great understanding of these things, but I read through, physics for children. That's what I like to read. But anyway, I was reading one recently, and it was talking about quantum mechanics. And what is interesting, and this is what I kind of alluded to in lesson number 1, the deeper and deeper, the closer you get to the truth, the less and less understandable it appears to be. And in quantum mechanics, they talk about matter as a point, a massless point. Well, what does that mean? I mean, how can a thing be a massless point? But that's what they talk about. And so, irrational numbers and things, and when you talk about infinity, that's something that is a construct that is useful for discussion, but that's all, really. So I appreciate you bringing that up. Go ahead, Randy.
I thought earlier about what John was saying. If God had created things totally opposite the way he did, that would have been normal for us. That's what we've been used to.
Mm-hmm.
He designed it from all different things. Normal now would have been more different than normal then.
Yeah. Okay. I'll concede God can do things in whatever manner He chooses. But what you have to keep in mind, though, is there are some ways that He could not have done them, right? He cannot do the things that are self-contradictory. Now, there's a lot in that Genesis narrative that I read that could have been done differently, I suppose, that are not self-contradictory. But the ones that are self-contradictory, God could not have done them another way. Go ahead, Titus.
We, in our finite understanding, determine what's self-contradictory. When you move from human understanding to divine understanding, that which we consider to be contradictory may not be contradictory at all. It seems to me that when you say God can do something, you're putting a human limitation on the divine God.
I agree with what you're saying there, and I certainly concede that there are things that I may believe in our limited understanding. There are things that I believe that very well may be not self-contradictory at all for God. But I believe there are things that are self-contradictory even for God. And let's go a little bit further and pursue this question about natural law, because remember, one of our stipulations is that God loves His creatures. And I think what we're kind of headed toward is the idea that the reason that we find pain in the universe, much of it, or at least a fraction of it, maybe I shouldn't say much because there's so much evil in the world. We're not talking about evil yet. Everyone understands that. We're not talking about evil at all. We're before the fall. We're not talking about the fall. We're talking about just the environment and pain that is associated with that environment. And yet God loves His creatures but allows that pain to exist. I saw a hand over here. Was it Brian? Go ahead.
Two things. What I was going to say, we do a very good job handling an extremely difficult topic that obviously we all make.
I'm sure.
The second thing to kind of bring it,
You're a moron.
I can get this kind of treatment. To bring it back to the Bible, God has foreknowledge of everything that's going to happen. He chooses to create the world and create man. Then we get to Genesis 6, where it said, and the Lord was sorry He had made man, and He was grieved in His heart. Didn't God choose to make man knowing everything that's going to happen? Doesn't that mean that it's exactly following the plan He laid out?
Oh, I think that's exactly correct. I think that is the universe. God created it, and everything that it includes, he created it in that way. But you know, the funny thing about that is, boy, I don't want to get too far. I'm getting off topic, but I'm gonna ask you to, not just you, Brian, but everybody to think about this idea. And I think I've used this example before, but I'm trying to think. I used the example before of, let us say that we're authors and we're writing a book, right? Or we're writing a story. And, you know, the author of the story kind of sees from outside the story, and he sees what the characters do, and he sees what the characters choose, right? And so that's pretty straightforward. Everybody understands how the author sees and foresees everything that happens. But now, let's take it a step further, and let us say that as we're writing the story, the creatures, or the characters in the story now have free will. And so now the characters in the story have the ability to make choices, right? And so I'm an author, I'm writing, but I am allowing the characters to make choices. And so I think I used the example, you know, John was sitting at his desk reading, and he heard a knock at the door. And so John makes a choice here. He either chooses to ignore it or to answer the door. And whatever choice John makes, Rhonda just said he never gets up to answer the door. I know that's what it was. But Rhonda, right? Or he says, Rhonda, see who's at the door. I hadn't thought of that, but anyway, but the character now makes that choice, right? And so, as an author, I see the choice that he's made, and I build that into my story. And every choice that every character makes, I have built into the story. I think that is a closer reflection of the creation that God has created. In some way, God has created this universe, and it includes all of the choices that the creatures have made. Now, did I say, I believe I said in the first meeting that we had, that when you get into these things, they get more and more difficult to understand. So the idea that the creation includes the choices of beings that, in our perspective, have not yet been created, that's a tough one. But I don't think that's tough for God. And so I think that is what we have. And I'll give you another example. Boy, am I off topic. I think about the creation as a painting. And God is allowing me to stick my brush in there now and then. But yet, He has the painting, and the painting is finished for Him. And He sees the entire painting. And it includes the little brush strokes that I made, and it includes the brush strokes of those not yet born. But He sees it all. And so, Brian, I think you're right. There is this, our choice is involved in this thing, but it's kind of hard to understand. So anyway, I apologize. That was way off topic. Anybody have any other thoughts on that? Oh, go ahead, Tom.
When God said, let us make man in our own image, what was that image? Because we know it's not flesh, right?
It's definitely not flesh. Yeah.
We know that they didn't understand the difference between good and evil. And we know that they wouldn't live forever in the first 2 chapters of Genesis. So I think if people say, hey, God created us in His image, they think hands, feet, eyeballs, and why there are. I'm thinking that the answer to the question that we've been going around in circles on this morning is found in what us was.
What do you think it means?
I think it's you're able to make choices, but you have that spirit, as I said earlier, that we're self-aware
Absolutely. I think you're exactly right. And that, see, now you got me off topic again. God created us in His own image. And for those of you that couldn't hear what Tom was saying, he says that includes our spiritual nature. I have used the word amphibious, which I think is reasonable. We are spiritual creatures, and yet we exist in this physical universe for now, just like, you guys remember when you were kids, right? You played with tadpoles in the pond. When I was a kid, we played with tadpoles. They were always in the horse trough. And then, you kind of watch them and they grow those little legs, but they were transforming. And we also are amphibious, transforming more from this spiritual, but we have the germ of the spiritual within us, which I think is in God's likeness. And so all of that is included in that question. But here's a thought, and we're out of time today. But here's a thought I want you to think about. Makes sense. God created the animals and the birds and the fish, right? We read that in Genesis. And He created man from what? The dust of the ground. Now, we don't have God using any part of the earth to create these other animals. That doesn't seem to be reflected in the passage. But it specifically states that God made man from the dust of the earth. Now, man falls, rebels, and you recall that there are ramifications of that. And those ramifications include the earth itself, doesn't it? You recall that the earth groans, right? And there were changes to the earth that were consequent to man's fall. And so I'll ask you to consider for next week. We're going to revisit this. And by the way, let me say this. I appreciate the feedback. We can disagree and try to understand things, especially these deep, hard questions. Brian, I appreciate you not calling me a moron, but 50% of the audience thinks that, or the group thinks that, so that's okay. But these are really hard questions, and we can wrestle with these things together, and I'm happy to do it. And so please, don't feel like that you're insulting me or that I'm going to be upset. I may disagree with you, and you certainly are going to disagree with me sometimes, but that's perfectly fine. But think about that question. Why is it that that God specifically made man from the dust of the earth? What is the significance of that? I think there's a deep mystery in there somewhere. I don't know what it is, but something to think about. So thank you all very much. God bless America.